Good afternoon. It's 4 o'clock. So even though people are still coming on, I'm going to get started. Well, good afternoon and welcome to the Iowa City Foreign Relations Program with guest speaker Ambassador Charles Ray. Thanks to Ambassador Ray and to everyone who has joined us online today. I'm Janice Weiner, member of ICFRC's Program Committee and host for today's program. Before we begin, ICFRC would like to acknowledge and thank its donors and sponsors for their support. This list includes Midwest One Bank, the University of Iowa's International Programs, the University of Iowa Public Policy Center, the Stanley UI Foundation Support Organization, the Iowa Arts Council through the Iowa Department of Cultural Affairs, the University of Iowa's Honors Program, and all of ICFRC's members. ICFRC also thanks citychannel 4 for its support in live streaming our in-person programs and for providing access to all of ICFRC's programs along with the UI library archives. ICFRC has adopted the Native American Land Acknowledgement prepared for the City of Iowa City's Ad Hoc Truth and Reconciliation Commission and Human Rights Commission. We recognize that our home community of Iowa City now occupies the homelands of Native American nations to whom we owe our commitment and dedication. The area of Iowa City was within the homelands of the Iowa, Meskwaki, and Sauk, and because history is complex and time goes back beyond memory, we also acknowledge the ancient connections of many other indigenous peoples here. The history of broken treaties and forced removal that dispossessed indigenous peoples of their homelands was and is an act of colonization and genocide that we cannot erase. We implore the Iowa City community to commit to understanding and addressing these injustices as we work toward equity, restoration, and reparations. As we get started, I would like to cover a few Zoom etiquette tips. This is the time to make sure you know where your video and audio mute and unmute buttons are located. Please keep your audio and video turned off for the duration of the presentation so you do not interrupt the speaker during his remarks. Following our speaker's presentation, around 4:40 or so, we will have a 15-minute Q&A. You will be able to submit your questions via the chat function. And at that time, we invite you to turn on your video, but please keep your audio muted to avoid any background noise. It is now my pleasure to introduce Ambassador Charles Ray, who will speak about race, American diplomacy, and why diversity is so important. Ambassador Ray has over 50 years of experience in international affairs, with 20 years in the US Army and over 30 years in the US Foreign Service. His military experience included assignments in unconventional warfare planning, psychological operations, intelligence, and public affairs. During his Foreign Service career, he managed trouble organizations in Asia and Africa and was instrumental in reestablishing a military-to-military relationship with Cambodia after the 9/11 terrorist attacks. As Deputy Chief of Mission in Sierra Leone, he managed the military training program and oversaw USAID's humanitarian assistance effort. He was also instrumental in brokering democratic elections in Sierra Leone, which saw a peaceful transfer of power from the military junta that had taken over the country the year before his assignment. This election took place during an externally supported rebel war. He encouraged the government of Cambodia to take a more active role in combating human trafficking and implemented a successful Muslim outreach program in that country, which reversed the negative views the small Islamic community had about the United States. He has served as Deputy Chief of Mission in Sierra Leone, was the first post-war consul general in Ho Chi Minh City, Vietnam, served as ambassador to Cambodia and Zimbabwe, and was appointed Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for POW Missing Personnel Affairs and Director of the Defense Missing Personnel Office, during which time he oversaw development of the US government interagency policy on personnel recovery, working with the Department of State, FBI, DEA, and USAID to develop a comprehensive plan to provide proactive and reactive support to US government personnel working abroad. Since retiring from government service in 2012, Ambassador Ray has consulted with the Department of Defense, participating in the development of a training continuum for defense attachés in support to chiefs of mission during personnel recovery operations, and provided training support to the US Army on interagency matters, preparing Army units for deployment abroad in non-combat operations. He also conducts a workshop on professional writing for Wrangell Foreign Affairs scholars. A prolific writer, he's published more than 60 books of fiction and nonfiction, including works on ethics, leadership, and diplomacy. He works with the Potomac Institute for Public Policy, developing a program on the use of diplomacy as a tool to combat terrorism and violent extremism. He has a bachelor in science in business administration from Benedictine College, an MS in systems management from the University of Southern California, and an MS in national security management from the National War College of the National Defense University. He speaks Thai, Vietnamese, and Mandarin, and is a member of the American Academy of Diplomacy and the Association of Black American Ambassadors. Ambassador Ray is chairman of the board of the Cold War Museum at Vint Hill, Virginia, and chairs the board of advisors of the Institute of Science, Technology, and the Arts, an international boarding school planned for construction in Orlando, Florida. I would add to this impressive compendium that he also worked on at least 2 important projects for AFSA, the American Foreign Service Association, which is the professional association and bargaining unit for the Foreign Service, which is where we got to know each other. So please join me in welcoming Ambassador Ray. Over to you, Ambassador.
Thank you. I will first apologize if the sound gets bad on this. I'm living in rural Maryland now, and we are low priority on fast internet. We're going to talk about race and diplomacy. Diplomacy is basically the art of getting along in a sensitive, tactful, and effective manner, and describes how nations deal with each other. And as you might find it easy to imagine, a society that discriminates against those groups within itself or within the society might find it difficult dealing with foreign societies, and the U.S. is no exception. Our diplomacy, our conduct of diplomacy in our foreign affairs since the beginning of the Republic has reflected attitudes toward race and ethnicity of the general society. As an example, before the Civil War, before the end of the Civil War, with the passage of the 13th Amendment, ending slavery and granting citizenship to Black Americans, people of color in this country were not considered citizens. In fact, under the Constitution, under a Supreme Court decision, were considered to be 3/5 of a person even. And this was a complicating factor for the U.S. and its diplomacy, even in those days. The U.S., in its dealings with European countries after Britain outlawed slavery, was complicated by the fact that slavery still existed here in the United States. It didn't, though, before 1865, stop Black Americans from attempting to enlist allies in their efforts to redress things and to change the attitude in official Washington on how we conducted diplomacy, because it was further complicated, this whole issue of race, with the independence of Haiti in 1840. An action, or I'm sorry, 1804, I apologize, in 1804, an action that the U.S. did not officially recognize until 1862. To give an idea of the complications of how race, diplomacy, and foreign policy were in this country, from the period of Haiti's independence until 1862, when we officially recognized the country and established diplomatic relations, President John Adams, still worked with the new leader of Haiti, Toussaint Louverture, to develop a democratic government and, in fact, outlaw slavery. And slavery was outlawed in Haiti before it was in the United States. So you run that through your mind as you can see a sense of how race and diplomacy are really conflicting issues in this country. We did not even send ambassadors abroad until 1893. And it wasn't until 1924, with the passage of the 1924 Foreign Service Act, known as the Rogers Act, that we even had a career diplomatic service. And that service was strictly segregated. The first African American, for example, to be posted abroad was during the administration of U.S. Grant, when Ebenezer Bassett in 1869 was sent as minister to Haiti. But after we had a professional foreign service in 1925, Clifton Wharton became the first person of color to pass the foreign service exam and enter the foreign service. Now, one would think that that would have been a cause for celebration, given the fact that we were pushing for democracy and freedom for people throughout the Western Hemisphere. But the response of the American Diplomatic Service in the person of Joseph Grew, who was the chair of the Foreign Service Personnel Board at the time, was to use the oral exam to block other Blacks from entering the Foreign Service, a situation that lasted for a full 20 years. The next person of color to join the U.S. Foreign Service was not admitted until 1945. And still, even with the pressure to admit people, and a number of African Americans entered the Foreign Service after 1945, there were still issues of discrimination. Blacks were shunted to posts in Africa, small posts, some in Latin America, but not to the prestigious post, and they were not given jobs of consequence within the State Department itself. In fact, in the 1950s, during the Civil Rights Movement, the Foreign Service used the clearance process to refuse to grant entry to African Americans. By 1957, for example, there was still no integrated eating space at the Foreign Service Institute in Roslyn for African American Foreign Service officers and staff. And it wasn't until intense amount of pressure from people like Terrence Todman, who became one of the preeminent people in the Foreign Service, preeminent African Americans in the Foreign Service, that the Foreign Service Institute sectioned off a portion of the FSI dining room for use by African American personnel. Now, this is not surprising, probably. I mean, in the 50s was a time of a lot of racial turmoil here in the U.S., the civil rights movement, voting rights, and efforts to get equal treatment for people of color. But it was also a time when countries in Africa were becoming independent, and it created issues for the U.S. In its diplomacy, with, for example, the independence of Ghana in 1957. It wasn't until 2 years later that we even had a bureau in the Department of State to deal directly with African countries. Prior to 1959, when the Africa Bureau was formed, foreign relations with African countries were dealt with through their former colonial powers in Europe. Fast forward to 1982, when I joined the Foreign Service. While there was no what I would call overt racism or even overt bias, there was, I observed during the early years of my career, a lot of unconscious bias, stereotyping, even slights that people of color and women in the Foreign Service had to endure. Just as an example, in 1994, even the American Foreign Service Association senior officials warned the department against pushing for too much diversity because of the potential for backlash on the part of those people who felt that in admitting more women and more minorities into positions in the Foreign Service would disadvantage the majority, basically white males who held those positions. Um, and as late as 2020, we were still, just as an example, the Congressional Budget Office did a study in 2020, which showed, or 2019, I'm sorry, which showed that the statistics on minorities in the Foreign Service and in the State Department were actually worse than they were in the 1980s. This is an issue that has consumed a lot of people's attention throughout the State Department, across government. I've worked with a number of organizations, including the American Academy of Diplomacy and the Association of Black American Ambassadors, to encourage the department to take a hard look at what it's doing in terms of diversity, of including previously marginalized people, more women and more people of color, Hispanics, Asian Americans, Native Americans, and African Americans in senior positions, giving them the opportunity to offer their talents to ensure that American foreign policy provides the best to the people of this country. And having served most of my 50 years of government service abroad and in countries where people were not of European stock, I can tell you that having these diverse views adds to the ability of our country to prosper, to ensure our security, and to have these harmonious, effective relations with other countries. When you have a homogenous group approaching a problem, you get poor results. Bringing different points of view up to the table when you're dealing with thorny issues, especially when you're dealing with issues across culture, makes for better diplomacy, makes for better foreign policy, just makes for better results. One of the issues, for example, that we've pushed for many years is having someone in the Department of State at sufficiently senior level to address these issues. That this is the current administration has at least started that by appointing to the Department of State a chief diversity officer who reports directly to the Secretary of State. But an issue that is still troubling, and we've had some meetings on this recently, is that while this office has been formed and it has been able to hire staff, it's not been given a budget to do any work. And it's also been hampered by the legal staff in the Department of State on access to the information that it needs to do its job. Some other issues currently that makes it difficult to think that we are actually making the progress we need to is when you look at the numbers of women and minorities who are in senior positions, who are in ambassadorial positions, it is frankly a bit disappointing because you have a paucity of people of color and of women who are in these jobs. And while the department has focused on recruiting minorities and women, the issue where it's fallen short is on retaining them, on moving them through the system and allowing them to be promoted, to have the same opportunities for advancement as everyone else. I could go on and talk for another 20 minutes and tell stories about the things that I've seen that show that we still have a long way to go in the Department of State and in the U.S. Foreign Service in living up to the language of the Foreign Service Act, for example, that calls for a professional career foreign service that reflects the diversity of this country. But I think what would be much more interesting, given the diversity of this audience, as I see looking at some of your names, is to see what questions you have and then have a dialogue and talk about the importance of diversity in any organization, but especially in today's world, the importance of diversity in U.S. diplomacy. So, Janice, back to you, and you can moderate the questions.
Okay, Ambassador, perhaps if you could just tell, say, one or two anecdotes, and then we will move directly into questions. We will still have plenty of time, but I think it would be helpful to give people sort of a little bit of a sense of some of what you actually experienced.
Okay, yeah, just an example. When I joined the Foreign Service in 1982, I had just finished a 20-year career in the Army, and most of my military time had been spent in Asia. I did 2 very brief tours in Germany, but I had probably 8 or 10 years service in parts of Asia, to include Korea, and 2 tours in Vietnam. Other than a rudimentary German, the only languages I spoke at the time were Asian languages. And so when I joined the Foreign Service, I was looking at a posting in Asia. I had to fight the personnel system to get my first assignment to China. And the argument I was given was, at the time, we didn't have education for dependents in China, so it would be very hard to get schooling for my 2 children who were in elementary school at the time. So instead, they wanted me to bid on a job in Africa, and what little I knew about Africa at the time made me wonder how schooling there could be any better. But that's sort of the way that worked out. I actually had people say to me that they thought I would be uncomfortable being assigned to Asia. How someone who'd spent more than 10 years of his life in Asia, who already spoke a couple of the languages, who was married to an Asian at the time, would be uncomfortable in Asia, but more comfortable in Africa, was a bit beyond me. But that was just an example. Another example, which wasn't really foreign service per se, but one that figured in discussions a couple of years ago, after the incident of the young FSO in Mexico who was harassed at the border. I remember coming back from Cambodia for a chief of mission conference in Hawaii, arriving very early at the airport in Honolulu, and getting in the immigration line for Americans. And I get up to this immigration officer, a young lady, who takes my passport, looks at me, opens the passport, which, by the way, had a stamp in the back that said, "The bearer of this passport is the American ambassador to the Kingdom of Cambodia." And she started to basically interrogate me. This went on for about 4 or 5 questions that were becoming increasingly personal. And I asked her why the questions. Her answer was, "I wanted to make sure you could speak English." What do you say to something like that? I mean, I just said, "I hope I passed," and she didn't smile and said, "Yeah, you passed," and pitched my passport back to me, didn't even say welcome back to the US. So, you know, it's that kind of almost unconscious, mindless treatment that I think a lot of diplomats of color have had to endure. Uh, I could recount about 30 years of such incidents, but you get the point, is that there are things that minorities and women, and I mean I've seen women in the Foreign Service treated in ways that men would never put up with. So I mean those are just two sort of incidents that stick in my mind when people ask, have you ever, I've had that asked, have you ever experienced bias as a diplomat? Well, yeah, as an ambassador, I experienced bias coming into a U.S. airport. So actually, as a deputy assistant secretary of defense, I was once put in secondary in an airport, in Miami airport, because I guess I had a name that was familiar with a name on their lookout list, despite traveling with a uniform military aide and a diplomatic passport.
Okay. I think I'm still sort of shaking my head at the "Do you speak English?" response.
Oh yeah, well,
That's amazing. So as some of you are already doing, as we move into the Q&A portion of the program, please submit your questions via the chat function. You can access that by clicking on the chat box icon, which is located near the bottom, near your audio and video buttons. While we wait for questions to come in, we thank our members who have renewed their annual membership and invite those of you who have not yet renewed or have not yet joined ICFRC to do so at icfrc.org. ICFRC depends on the financial support of its members and friends to continue to provide high quality international educational programs at no cost to our community. So we appreciate your membership support. With that, we move into our Q&A session, and please free to turn on your video at this time if you'd like, but remain muted. So the first question that I see in the chat is, can you point to a nation that has a foreign service reflective of the diversity of that nation's population?
That's a good question, and I would say probably, yeah. I actually have a hard time thinking of a country that I mean, for example, the UK is almost as diverse as we are. I think the Canadians probably come closest in my experience that I've encountered. There's probably more diversity across the ethnic groups and gender in the Canadian diplomatic service than almost any other. The Australians, believe it or not, are actually doing a lot in increasing the diversity in their diplomatic service, and I think the British are probably somewhere in the neighborhood of us, trying but not succeeding very well. But when I look across the board at other countries, I don't actually. I mean, I would not hold up any other country as necessary a model for us to copy.
So sort of I would add a question to that, which is what programs exist currently in order to help diversify the foreign service, and have they and did the Foreign Service and the State Department move backwards during the previous administration?
Okay, to start with, I'll answer your second question first. We did move a bit backwards during the last administration, but in all fairness, we were already moving back before the election. I mean, before the 2016 election, I think it was 2014 or 2015, there were statistics showing that the department was not even meeting its recruitment goals in terms of minorities and women. But what's worse is that it was, the retention figures were horrible. I mean, if you looked at the State Department and if you looked at the Foreign Service, the issue was they were hitting very close to their recruitment goals, but as you progressed through the ranks, the numbers got smaller and smaller until at the senior levels, both in the civil service and the foreign service, the participation or the presence of minorities and of women was abysmal, and it got worse for the career foreign service across the board in the last administration, because frankly, a lot of the senior people, without regard to whether they were minorities, women, or what, were marginalized, forced to resign, or basically sidelined. So, that the issue is we've been regressing probably since about I'd say maybe 2004, 2005. It would, if you just look at the numbers, and if you look at the progression through the ranks and retention, you see backsliding. I mean, if you look at the numbers for recruiting, yes, we've had some good numbers there, but that doesn't tell the whole picture. Now, what programs do we have? There's the Wrangel program and the Pickering programs for the U.S. Foreign Service, for the State Department, which, while they attempt to recruit women and minorities, they're not race-based. In fact, they look at a number of demographics that have nothing to do with race. For example, recruiting students from Appalachia, from the Midwest, and from other areas of the country that haven't been widely represented in the Foreign Service. There's also the PAIN program for USAID. These three programs are the primary entry points presently for minorities and women, and this also includes LGBT people as well to enter the Foreign Service. And oh, by the way, just as a point I'd like to point out is that last year and this year, the numbers for both the PAIN and Pickering programs were increased, so that there are coming in this year through those programs.
Okay, thank you. So the next question is, over the course of your career as a Foreign Service officer and an ambassador, have you encountered resistance, subtle or not, to your position, especially as ambassador? And were you fully accepted by the host country?
Actually, I had very little problem being accepted by the host countries. I actually had more problem as an African American, as an ambassador in Zimbabwe, than I did in Cambodia. I mean, in Cambodia, I actually had zero problem being accepted, even though I didn't speak much Khmer, but I speak Vietnamese and Thai, and the Cambodians actually found that to be quite endearing, I think. In Zimbabwe, the issue was we didn't have very good relations with the country to start with, and the radicals or hardliners in Mugabe's government looked for anything that they could to stick a finger in the U.S. eye, and I was called names that I will not repeat on this presentation by members of Mugabe's government. I think probably the most polite thing they called me was war criminal, and a lot of that was based on race, I hate to say. Where I found not so much overt bias, but gentle pushback, if I will, it was from Americans and here in the U.S. Just two examples. Once, when I was the consul in Chiang Mai, Thailand, I was responsible for supervising the one junior officer we had at the consulate. And a gentleman came into the consulate. I was standing at the visa window, and he walked up and he looked me in the eye and he said, "Can I speak to the American in charge?" And when I told him it was me, he literally did a jaw mouth agape, double take, and looked as if he didn't believe me. The other, when I was diplomat in residence at the University of Houston for the 2005-2006 school year, and I was invited to speak at the University of Texas campus near the Mexican border. I think near McAllen. I don't remember the town now, but we have a diplomatic security field office in Houston, and the agent in charge of the field office sent one of his junior agents with me on the trip, just so that he'd give this kid a chance to see parts of South Texas that he hadn't been in. We drove down in my car, and we parked, and we walked into the professor's office, who was to be my host. The young diplomatic security agent, who was white, opened the door and held it for me, and I walked in, and the professor walked over to him and stuck out his hand to welcome the ambassador. These type incidents, it's a sort of unconscious stereotyping, or acting on perceptions, are unfortunately all too common. I've lost track of the number. I actually had a gentleman, when I was ambassador to Cambodia, who was part of the adoptive father, and I went to the consular section to greet all of the families who were getting their children and getting their visas. And after talking to this gentleman for about 5 minutes, he complimented me on my English. I don't know what it is. It's just something about, if you're a person of color, you're not supposed to speak English. And when I asked him why, he said he didn't realize that Cambodians could speak English that well. So just those are cocktail party stories, but they're true. You couldn't make these things up.
Right. So I'll take the liberty of responding to one of the questions in the chat, which is how large is the Foreign Service and the State Department, and that there are approximately 13,000 Foreign Service employees, 11,000 civil service, and abroad in our embassies and consulates, about 45,000 locally employed staff.
And to put that in perspective too, by the way, that total number, to include the 30 or 40,000 local employed staff overseas, is still less than an Army brigade.
And with respect to your stories about the young attaché who came with you, I mean, you're right about the part about women too. I can't tell you the number of times I walked into a meeting as the senior officer, the officer in charge, and whoever I was talking to refused to look me in the eye. They kept talking to the guy who was with me, who worked for me.
Yeah.
So
that happens unfortunately a lot. And this is a point I think that people don't appreciate is, you think that as a woman or as a minority, your issues are when you go overseas and dealing with foreigners. But the fact is that, except in some of your more fundamentalist countries, if you're the American diplomatic representative, you get special treatment no matter who you are. It's here in the US that you run into the biggest problems.
So there's the sort of continuing on that line. There's a question that how does the inability of the U.S. to reconcile its past and ongoing racist practices and policies most impact its diplomacy on global issues? There's a really little question for you to answer.
Well, it's a matter of credibility. I mean, in diplomacy, credibility is the coin of the realm. If you lack credibility, then you can't get people to do the things you want them to do. And so when we go into foreign ministries, for example, to talk to them about how they treat ethnic minorities within their country, and they come back with, well, what about the way your government treats, or how minorities are treated in your country? And if you don't have a good response to that, then you don't have any credibility with that audience. And just to give you an example, I mean, one of the issues that I've run into repeatedly when I've had to talk human rights with foreign governments is I've actually had a foreign minister look me in the eye and say, "How can you sit here and criticize me for the way our country treats the particular minority we were talking about, when you yourself get treated, your people get treated the way you do in some parts of the U.S." And if you can't answer that, you know, it undermines your credibility, and there's no way that you're going to be able to convince a government to do the things that you want them to do. And that's the whole issue about having a diverse diplomatic service. We talk about rights of women in most of the countries where we have embassies. Rights for women, education for women and girls is one of our foreign policy points. If that country, if the people of that country, if that government looks at our embassy and they see the only women they see in our embassy are the office management specialists or you know, the lower ranking people, our our message is undercut quite a bit. Same thing goes for ethnic minorities. If we're pushing an issue, but we don't appear to be making at least an effort to do that same thing in our own country, who's going to want to listen to us? I mean, it's just practical.
Um, the the head of the ICFRC notes that we have a number of university students who are interested in pursuing careers in the Foreign Service and international organizations. What advice would you have for them, and especially for young people of color?
I would say if you are interested, by all means, I mean, I don't, you know, I tell these stories, and that you might think that then I'm sort of this bitter person, and I'm not. I think my 30 years in the Foreign Service were probably the most meaningful of a pretty long life, and I wouldn't trade it for anything. What I say to people who are interested is prepare yourself. Don't expect too much, but don't accept too little. And by all means, go for it, because we need people like these young people, people of color, women, to bring new ways of thinking and to put fresh blood into how we get things done. And I still think that the life of a diplomat, it's really not a profession, it's a calling. I mean, it probably ranks as one of the most meaningful things that you can do, because not only are you helping your country, but you're in a position to help people in other countries and in other societies, and you grow as a person. The more variety you have in your life, the more you grow and develop as a person. So my advice would be, go for it, prepare yourself, learn, never stop learning, never stop trying, and don't let anyone talk you out of it.
So, and how does the U.S. determine which countries it will send officers to?
I don't understand what you mean, because you mean, how
So,
does it determine who
right. So,
goes to what country?
right. How does it determine who,
Oh,
you know, how does the State Department determine who goes where? Not the ambassadorial process necessarily, because that's run by the White House,
yeah.
but otherwise.
Well, the assignment system, the way it's supposed to work is that you put in your preferences for places to go, and if you have the required language, the required job skills, the required seniority, then you compete um, equally for all jobs. And so the system as it's on paper is that everyone with the requisite qualifications has an equal shot at every job that they're qualified for. In reality, I can't talk about how they do it now because I've been out since 2012, but during my 30 years, the reality of it is, um, for most jobs, it works that way. But now and then, just as an example, there are both bureaucratic and, I would say, unconsciously biased mechanisms that creep in to decide who goes where. Just as an example, uh, there was in the department, I don't know if it was written, but I know how it worked in practice, a restriction on sending ethnic Chinese, or especially those who were immigrants who became U.S. citizens and joined the Foreign Service, to assignments in China. When I first went to Vietnam in as a diplomat in 1998, uh, there were restrictions on sending ethnic Vietnamese Foreign Service officers to serve in either Hanoi or Ho Chi Minh City. I think they've lifted those restrictions. Um, there was also in I don't I at least through about the mid 80s, a tendency to offer, suggest, encourage officers of color to bid on Latin America, Europe, and Africa. And I know when I was in China, for example, from 1983 until about 1987, I think in we had the embassy, Guangzhou, Shanghai, and Shenyang. So an embassy and 3 consulates. And I think there were 5 people of color in that entire country on the embassy staff. I mean, it's that. So that's, I mean, how it worked. How it works now, I couldn't tell you, but my guess would be people being people. I mean, you don't change attitudes overnight. That there probably still is a little of this sort of unconsciously trying to get people to go certain places. I know a few of the Hispanic FSOs that I know have said that they've been encouraged to bid on Latin American posts as opposed to, say, Asia. So, but anyway, the system is that you put in your preferences at a point during your tour for your onward assignment based on your language, grade, and other qualifications, and on vacancies.
So to respond to sort of a follow-up question, yes, you can request to be posted to a specific country, but it has to do with applying for or bidding on specific jobs that are going to be open in those countries.
And you're competing with everyone else who wants that job. And another, to those people who are interested in becoming diplomats and joining the Foreign Service, the key is, if it's a London, Paris, Rome, as a young neophyte diplomat, you're going to be competing with everyone else who wants to go to London, Paris, and Rome. Your best bet for getting a good assignment that's both professionally developing and interesting would be to look at the places where fewer people want to go. My first tours as a diplomat, I went to Guangzhou, I went to Shenyang, China, which was at the back end of nowhere. I went to Chiang Mai, Thailand, and then I went to Sierra Leone. And I didn't have a lot of competition for any of those jobs, but they were some of the best jobs in the Foreign Service in terms of professional development and of being able to do something interesting.
Yeah, I would second that view. The next question is, do many Foreign Service officers transition from the military, and what can you say about the challenges of that transition?
I think more do now than when I came in 1982. When I came in, most of the former military people who came into the Foreign Service came in as specialists, either as diplomatic security or in specialties like budgeting or general services. I don't remember the exact number, but I know that when I joined the Foreign Service in 1982, the number of former military people who were generalists in the Foreign Service was less than 100. Probably just double digits, not, I mean, 40 or 50. There wasn't a lot of recruiting effort on military bases. And frankly, I mean, we talk about race and the diplomacy. I could talk about former professions and diplomacy. One of the biggest issues that I faced during 30 years in the Foreign Service had nothing to do with my race, but had everything to do with the fact that I had been career military. I faced more discrimination from fellow Foreign Service officers for having been career military than anything else.
What form did that take, and why do you
Well,
think
I
that
guess
was?
as an example, you know how people say things sometimes that they don't mean to hurt your feelings, but it is. I can remember being in meetings, and if something military would come up, all heads would swivel my way and say, give it to Charlie because he can talk to those military guys. He's one of them, or all the way to comments like having a female supervisor, my supervisor in one of my jobs as a junior officer, make a comment that some slang word that someone had asked her was described as, oh, that's something that these male chauvinist military types call, people. That type of thing. Up until probably, I would say, until my retirement, if a job came up that had any military component in it, if I was anywhere within earshot, I would be suggested for it. I mean, it's the type of sort of stereotyping. If you were in the military, therefore you can deal with the military. When I was in Thailand, for example, the military did these annual exercises with the Thai Army, and I was the embassy consulate liaison to the military every time their planes touched down.
So we're sort of we've run out of questions in the queue. I'd like to ask sort of a closing question, which is a more general question. There is really right now an unprecedented blockade of ambassadorial nominees in the Senate. I mean, I think the Biden administration has confirmed they just confirmed today, I believe, someone to be Assistant Secretary for European Affairs, which is really sat open for about 2.5 years now. But there are probably 70 or 80 ambassadors in the pipeline who have been blocked by one particular senator, and they're having to try and start to break them loose in small chunks. Could you just comment briefly about the effect that has on our foreign policy and security?
Well, when you consider what some of these countries are, where they're, for example, South Korea, we don't have an ambassador for South Korea yet. It sends a signal to that country that we don't consider them very important. I mean, the fact that a lot of these positions you've had a charge d'affaires instead of a confirmed ambassador for a few years now, it makes these countries feel diminished because they look at it as we, the United States, don't think very highly of them, and it makes it a lot harder for the people in that embassy to get their jobs done. I mean, in some countries they consider it as an insult. It's basically a slight when we take so long to get ambassadors into the pipeline. And I'll have to say it's bad enough that you've got this one senator who's blocking nominations for a reason that has nothing to do with the ambassadors who are being blocked. But you also have a very slow pace of names being sent to the Senate as well. I mean, so there's a lot of blame to go around. Not only is the Senate dragging its feet and getting nominations approved, but the administration is not sending as many up as I personally think they should be sending. I mean, It's really bad because it does hamper our ability to convince people to work with us. I mean, if they don't think we think highly of them, then why should they go out of their way for us? It's we're digging a hole. We've dug a hole, and we haven't put the shovel down yet. We just keep making it worse. It's
That's an apt metaphor. So if there are no other questions with that, we will conclude our program. Really a big thank you to you, Ambassador Ray, for your presentation today and for sharing your expertise and your experience with us. I forgot to bring my mug out with me, but I am honored to virtually present you with the Iowa City Foreign Relations Council's highly coveted mug for coffee, tea,
here.
or the beverage of your choice. We will coordinate delivery details with you very soon. And thank you
Okay.
so much to our viewing audience for joining us and for your excellent questions. We are adjourned.